And welcome to another British Cartographic Society Teatime Talk. My name is Chris Rebutus, coordinator for the Teatime Talks and today's chair. Today we have a talk from Huw Thomas, curator of maps for the National Library of Wales, and he'll be giving the talk Decorative and Elegantly Presented. So to go into more detail and to actually give the talk, I will pass us over to Huw, where he can tell us more.
Good evening. Hello, Christopher.
Hello there.
As Christopher said, I'm Huw Thomas, the map curator at the National Library of Wales. As a map curator, I'm used to talking about all sorts of maps. But what about the people who create them? This year, our annual Cartographic Map Symposium, held tomorrow at the National Library of Wales and also online, is going to be all about the people who make the maps. So tonight, to coincide with that event, which is being held in association with the British Cartographic Society, I'm going to talk about a map maker, though I might show the odd map too. The subject of tonight's talk is Robert Johnson and his groundbreaking survey of the manors of Crickhowell and Tretower. Robert Johnson was an artist, surveyor and architect who went on to become MP for the Monmouth boroughs and was later knighted. Johnson was born in Buckinghamshire, but when or exactly where has remained obscure. Hasler's History of Parliament until 1603 identifies him as the son of William Johnson of North Crawley, born in about 1537. But Thrush and Ferris, in their continuation of the work beyond 1604, reject this on the grounds that he would have been too old to take an active part in the 1614 Parliament. Instead, they suggest that he came from Buckingham itself. At the present time, his early years must remain something of a mystery. We first come across Johnson in about 1583, working for William Somerset, the 3rd Earl of Worcester. His name appears on this survey of part of the Gower, alongside that of Edward Somerset, son and heir of the Earl, who was at the time styled Lord Herbert. I've highlighted Johnson's name on this enlarged section. It reads in translation, Robert Johnson, Gent, Auditor and Surveyor of the Earl of Worcester. His name appears on at least 2 more documents from the Badminton papers held by the library. An inquisition taken at Crickhowell at a court of survey, and a survey of the Lordship of Chepstow, both from 1584. He was also involved in a survey of Tiddenham in Gloucestershire, just over the border from Chepstow. Surveys such as these were produced as a tool for estate management. All of these surveys are textual documents and are quite unremarkable for the time, which makes what came next even more extraordinary. One of the greatest treasures in the map collection at the National Library of Wales is the survey of the manors of Crickhowell and Tretower, which was created by Johnson in 1587. Like many other such estate surveys of the period, it includes a textual description of the estate, its extent, its properties and tenants. But, unlike most other surveys, it also includes a set of maps produced as part of the survey. The Earls of Worcester were created Dukes of Beaufort in 1682, and the volume came to the library amongst the deposited papers of the Welsh parts of the Badminton estate of the Dukes of Beaufort. Thus, the volume has remained in the hands of the Somerset family from the time of its creation until its arrival in the library. William Somerset inherited the manors of Crickhowell and Tretower in 1549. The reason for this and other surveys was that after the Act of Union, the Marcher lordships ceased to be private fiefs and came under the same laws as the rest of England and Wales. This meant that new rules of ownership applied and new taxes could be levied. As a result, it was important to know exactly what land you owned, what it was used for, who was farming it, and what they owed the landowner. There also seems to have been some concern on the part of the Earl about encroachments on his land, and part of Johnson's job as a surveyor and auditor was to record such encroachments so that the Earl could make sure he was getting all the rents he was due. In addition to being an aid to estate management, surveys such as this were also manifestations of the power of the landowner. This volume was designed as much for decoration as for a working document. This is the earliest extant example of a Grand Estate Atlas, designed as a coherent volume of decorative estate maps, the maps being produced as an integral part of the survey. This work stands on the cusp of the medieval and modern world. This can be seen in the title page. On one side, we have the ornate Latin script. On the other, a much more cursive script, giving the title in English. Part of the work, in Latin, follows the traditional written survey style. But about halfway through the book, things change. The text is now in English and is generally related to one of the maps, which now start to appear. This survey is much more like later surveys with a schedule indexed to the map. The schedules provide the name of the tenant, the date of the lease, the yearly rent, etc., with a symbol linking it to the correct plot as shown on the map. It appears that only the leasehold land was mapped. This is the land which the Earl would be most interested in, as it would refer to him at the end of the lease. The borough of Crickhowell is not mapped, however. There is a list of street names, most of which are unchanged today. Within each street, the names of the burgage holders on each side of the road are given, so that it is possible to know exactly who was living in a particular property at the town at this time. Excuse me. Boundaries of parishes and commons were recorded by perambulation in the old-fashioned way, rather than by maps. These written descriptions, also known as bounders, are texts describing the boundaries of the different parts of the manors. Again, these are in English rather than in Latin. The volume ends with an index to the contents, showing that this volume was created as a single work, not as disparate items bound together later. The number of blank pages and the unfinished state of one map suggest that the volume may not, in fact, have been completed. The maps themselves are beautifully drawn to a common scale and using the same style and symbology throughout. The standard of surveying is very good, and most of the maps can easily be identified with the modern map. Many of the maps have one or more cartouches giving the names of the tenants and the symbol matching their holdings. It has been suggested that these markings may have been derived from the markings or brands used to identify each tenant's livestock. The fields are coloured to show the different tenements, the trees show wooded areas, and buildings, roads, rivers and bridges are all carefully drawn to provide something both useful and pleasing to the eye. Peter Barber, writing in the History of Cartography, singles out the Johnson volume and describes the maps thus. The 46 maps are handsome but ultimately functional. And he goes on to say that they lost nothing of their functionality through being decorative and elegantly presented, whence came the title of this talk. Peter has always been one of the great champions of Johnson's survey as the earliest real mapped estate survey, and has encouraged us at the National Library to make it better known. The artistry of the maps is nowhere more evident than in the exquisitely drawn buildings, each carefully drawn in minute detail. Here we see the original wooden bridge at Crickhowell, as well as Crickhowell Castle. The other image shows Tretower, including the manor house and the castle. Johnson's work as an architect and his precise eye for detail give us a fascinating glimpse of the built environment of the 16th century Wales. As was common practice at the time, the buildings are drawn in perspective rather than plan view, but in many ways this helps us to visualise them in the landscape and compare them with those buildings and remains which are still standing. Anybody familiar with Tretower will recognise the manor house, which is still there, as well as the castles as well as the castle, whose remains are nearby. In fact, the buildings are so accurately rendered that some local people can still recognize their homes in the drawings on these maps. The survey provides a valuable source of information about the landscape and environment in the Crickhowell and Tretower areas, providing evidence of the patterns of land use and ownership in a typical early modern setting. The maps are still very much used as key documents for the history of the area, and they shed unique light on the topography of an area which was part of a major estate. The survey contains the earliest extant set of estate maps for Wales, and is a unique record of the locality at a particular point in time. Its significance lies in the fact that this is the earliest example of its type in existence, and therefore acts as a precursor to all later surveys which include maps, most of which did not appear until 2 centuries later. The combination of the old style written survey together with the new style of map survey makes this volume invaluable in showing the development of estate mapping. It is on the cusp of a new technological revolution in cartography, which would later completely replace much of the written text with images. In addition, the aesthetic value of the maps produced cannot be underestimated. They are items of beauty in their own right. One other interesting fact is that it is not the only survey of these properties carried out. In 1760, Meredith Jones produced an estate map volume of much the same area. Having 2 surveys for the same area almost 200 years apart, and both predating the Tithe Map and Ordnance survey mapping, is quite rare, and allows us to create a picture of the changing landscape as shown in maps for a continuous period of some 400 years. Looking at the portrayal of Tretower in this map compared to Johnson's, it is clear that the level of detail and artistry in Johnson's work was exceptional, and not just in his own time. Jones's work is much more workmanlike, though decorative in its own way. In addition to this survey, John Dowding also produced a survey in 1789, which references the written bounder from the 1587 volume, and displays some similar features to the Jones volume. And in 1813, an exact manuscript copy of Johnson's original survey was created. Such was the value and accuracy of Johnson's work that it was still being referenced over 200 years after it was produced. Some years ago, local historians in the area carried out an in-depth study of the maps. They found that most of them were easily recognizable in the modern landscape, and that by comparing the plans to modern maps, they could locate them exactly on the ground. They found that the accuracy of Johnson's survey was very good when looked at alongside the modern OS maps. I have no doubt that you've heard about our colleagues from the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales and their Deep Mapping Estate Archives project, where they used historic OS mapping to create a base layer on which old estate maps could be georeferenced. And indeed, I believe they won a prize from the BCS last year or the year before, I can't remember. Well, we're currently working with them to find the resources to digitize and georeference the rest of the 25-inch mapping for Wales. If this is successful, it will allow us to start georeferencing estate maps, such as the Badminton maps. Once we can do this, we will be able to assess the accuracy of the mapping even more closely. In the meantime, I've had a go at georeferencing one of the maps myself. It's a very rough and ready job, and using a modern base layer makes things more difficult, not helped by the development of the village of Llangattock and someone slapping a canal through the middle of the park. But hopefully you can see from this screenshot that the correspondence isn't too bad for something made 437 years ago. Robert Johnson's survey of Crickhowell and Tretower is a unique and valuable part of the story of estate mapping in Britain. And it was for this reason that the library decided in 2016 to put the volume forward as a candidate for inclusion on the UNESCO Memory of the World UK Register. Our nomination to the register was successful, and on the 21st of June 2016, at an awards ceremony at the Senedd in Cardiff, Robert Johnson's survey of Crickhowell and Tretower was one of 8 items and collections which joined the UK Memory of the World Register. The entire volume has been digitised and can be seen on the library's website. Few, if any, other maps by Johnson are known. So what about the rest of his life? Well, most of the information we have about Johnson's later life comes from parliamentary and related sources. Excuse me. The 3rd Earl of Worcester died in 1589 in Hackney, but he was buried at Raglan in the parish church. His son Edward, who we saw named alongside Johnson in the survey of Gower, became the 4th Earl of Worcester. Clearly, the links between the two continued, as we find Johnson acting as an agent for the Earl in a land transaction in 1605. In 1591, he was appointed as Keeper of Gaul in the Forest of Dean, presumably thanks to the influence of the Earl. Gaul, or Gale rents, are fees paid to the Crown by free miners in the Forest of Dean for the right to extract coal and other minerals from beneath the forest. The keeper was responsible for collecting the rents and for keeping a record of the gales, the subsurface areas, which were being mined. The post still exists, and one of the main tasks is the keeping of accurate maps of the workings. So this is a post which would be very suitable for a surveyor like Johnson. Johnson became MP for the Monmouth boroughs in 1597 and served again in the parliaments of 1601, 1604 and 1614. As MP for Monmouth, he was said to have been a staunch defender of the borough's rights. Again, it is probable that the Earl was behind his entry into Parliament, possibly through his Herbert connections. In spite of his links to South Wales, he was still very active in his native Buckinghamshire and surrounding counties. In 1603, he became a Justice of the Peace in Buckingham, though he mostly seems to have been living in London by this time. The map shown here is Braun and Hogenberg's map of Elizabethan London, produced a quarter of a century before Johnson became an MP, but relatively little would have changed in the intervening period. Sorry, excuse me. It's probable that the Earl's patronage brought him into court circles, where he became acquainted with Robert Cecil, with whom he corresponded in 1601. In 1602, he was appointed an Exchequer surveyor and clerk of deliveries at the Ordnance Office, thanks to Cecil's influence, and in 1604 he was knighted. From his arrival in Parliament, he seems to have been a very active MP. In his first Parliament, he was named to committees concerning weights and measures and pawnbrokers, and may also have attended the committee concerning Newport Bridge, Newport being one of the constituent parts of the Monmouth boroughs constituency. In 1601, he was making speeches about temperance, including calling for innkeepers who failed to restrain their customers from drinking too much to face corporal punishment. One of his main preoccupations seems to have been reform of the administration and sale of Crown lands. This was a topic on which he corresponded with Cecil, and this may have had something to do with his appointment as a commissioner in the sale of the Crown woods, where his abilities as a surveyor would have been invaluable. In 1608 and 1609, we find him acting alongside Sir Francis Stoner as commissioners for the sale of woods in Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, Northamptonshire and Oxfordshire. There is a fascinating sequence of correspondence relating to this commission in the Cecil papers held at Hatfield House. It starts in January 1609 with a letter from Stoner to Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, who was Secretary of State and Lord High Treasurer, stating that the survey of Oxfordshire is complete. There follows a series of letters from Stoner, Johnson and Lord Norreys, a major Oxfordshire landowner, where it becomes apparent that Norreys is not entirely happy with the two commissioners and that the sale of woods is being delayed by him. Francis Norreys was at the time Baron Norreys of Rycote, though he later became the first Earl of Berkshire. At the same time, the commissioners seem to have been having similar issues in parts of Berkshire, though elsewhere things seem to be proceeding more smoothly. By June 1609, the situation with Norreys seems to have deteriorated even further. Norreys wrote to Cecil on the 5th of June, claiming that the commissioners were abusing their position and also complaining about his lieutenant, Sir Francis Curson. On the 8th of June, Cecil responded. The first line of his letter is well worth quoting. I have received your letter, wherein, though you touch at many things, few require answer. Cecil goes on to reject the accusations, and with regard to the complaints about Curzon, basically says, it's nothing to do with me. On the same day, Johnson and Stoner also wrote to Cecil, complaining that Norreys was impeding their work and essentially asking if they could quit. On the 13th of June, Norreys writes another letter to Cecil, making further accusations. Clearly, he hadn't received Cecil's letter at this time. At some point after this, he obviously did receive it, because on the 16th of June, he writes again, saying that he is sorry to perceive that Cecil has condemned him unheard. The next day, Johnson wrote to Cecil, thanking him for his support, but stating that Norreys is still stopping them from doing their work, and that they cannot proceed that year unless their commission is renewed. He then goes on to suggest that the reason that Norreys is being so obstructive is that he wants to sell the wood for himself. Clearly, Cecil was having none of this, and in July he renewed the commissions, writing to the sheriffs of the 4 counties, enclosing the commissions and instructing them to pay the commissioners. This is an interesting exchange, as it shows that being a surveyor of Crown lands could be quite a fraught undertaking. The correspondence in the Cecil archive shows that this wasn't the only commission of the sale of crowned woods which ran into difficulty, nor were Johnson and Stoner the only surveyors to face accusations. In Hampshire, John Norden faced similar difficulties, as did Thomas Johnson, possibly a relative of Roberts, when he was carrying out a commission in Durham. Johnson was clearly a noted surveyor. Indeed, in 1601, Edward Glascock quipped that Johnson had better skill in measuring of land than men's conscience. It has been suggested that he may have been related not just to Thomas Johnson, but also to John Johnson, both of whom were surveyors of Crown lands under James I. In the early 1600s, he also seems to have become interested in London's water supply and sewerage system, and other matters concerning the capital, which was now his main abode, such as buildings, which would make sense given his interest in architecture. His post of Clerk of Deliveries gave him lodgings in the Tower of London, where the Ordnance Office was housed. We don't know if he was the first surveyor to reside there, but he certainly wasn't the last. After Cecil's death in 1612, Johnson seems to have fallen out of favour and was less active in Parliament. He continued in his post with the Ordnance Office, but fell ill in about 1620, and in 1622 he died. His son, Edward, possibly named for the 4th Earl of Worcester, appears to have taken over his post. Robert Johnson is one of those Elizabethan polymaths who remade medieval Britain into the country we see today. As a lawmaker, he helps to shape the administration of the Crown lands and other government offices. But it is his innovation as a surveyor for which he will always be known. If you'd like to hear more about other map makers, then please do join us for Carter Cymru tomorrow. There is still time to get a ticket to listen to the event online. Amongst the speakers will be the Society's own Seppi Casateri, who will be talking about the work of BCS. I'll be talking about some famous and maybe not so famous Welsh cartographers, and Alex Kent and John Davis will be talking about Soviet mapping, plus lots more. For further details of the event and to book, please visit the library's event pages using the link on the screen, which I'll add into the chat, or just visit our website at www.library.wales. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for that. That's been a very interesting talk and a nice lead into what you've got running tomorrow. So, if anyone's interested, that's you should hopefully have these links in the chat for you to look at. So that should be very useful. So, again, I'd like to say thank you for the talk there. We'll move on to the Q&A. So again, if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat as usual, and we'll work our way through them.
So I've just put the link on.
Yes, we've got them there. Okay, no, that was a very interesting talk. It's very interesting seeing how accurate. It was interesting seeing how accurate the maps he'd produced were at the time, and how they still aligned fairly well with with modern mapping, which is interesting when you look at the mapping of the time that it was. It seems to have just matched up.
Yeah, and it's as I say, it was a very rough and ready job I did, but it worked very well. But the local historians who've been doing the work they've done a lot of work on this over the years, and they've not using GIS, but just a map and a hand and eye coordination and so forth. They've managed to match up the vast majority of them to actual places on the ground, and they do match very well.
No, that is very interesting to hear how that worked, and it's interesting to see what an elaborate career he had across the across the country.
Indeed, it's these Elizabethan polymaths. They do get around quite a bit. See this with some of the people I'm talking about tomorrow. And sadly, because I've only got half an hour to talk tomorrow, I've had to hack away at what I originally planned to talk about. So some of them have fallen by the wayside, I'm afraid. But otherwise, I'd be going on for twice as long as I should be.
Absolutely no problem. Okay, right. So we have a question in. So we've got some questions coming in there. So it's how many maps do you have in your collection?
We generally say about 1.5 million. Nobody's ever actually counted them, because we've got better things to do with our time. But yeah, about 1.5 million, we reckon.
No, that's quite a wide collection. It's it would be interesting when someone does actually go and count everything that you've got in there, and someone will at one point decide to do that, I suspect, and
probably not in my lifetime.
The collection will only get larger in that time, so that's they'll have a larger challenge.
I've been saying 1.5 million for quite a while now. So.
Okay, so the next question is, what do you think inspired his innovative style of mapping?
That's a very good question. It seems to have kind of come out of nowhere. There's, there are estate maps, individual estate maps, people like Agas and so forth, but that, certainly he doesn't seem to have had any history of it, or maybe he did, maybe he was producing maps, but we don't have any other examples really. I did hear somebody did say something about one other map, but I don't know whether they were misremembering something. So, but it seems to be a one-off really. And again, there aren't many more like it for the next 200 years.
No, I have to say it's for a one-off. What may have been a one-off, it seems to have been as close as you can get to modern mapping levels of quality and what we could see, and it seems to be as good as mapper you can make, really. For it's nicely there's a lot of balance in there, and everything. He's actually thought out a lot of the art as well as the factual side, which is
and they're incredibly useful, and they're incredibly beautiful, and you know, I can't believe it just happened overnight. You know, I mean, there must have been some lead into it. You know, he must have, and he was very into surveying. He was sort of esteemed as a surveyor, as we've seen. But and it may be, is this a lone survival from a wider career of work? You know, wider body of work. We just don't know really.
No, it would be a real shame. It would be a real shame if that's all that we've got left of what appears to have been a fairly high level work in that particular time period. Just think of a lot of the mapping that you can see. It's can be progressively hit and miss.
There's a lot of mapping going on at this time, but nothing that compares to that really.
Mm-hmm. No, it's just a big quality difference, which is quite impressive, and and the fact is that again, the fact you can just about use it today as a
yeah. I mean, you know, as I say, if anyone who's been to Tretower, you can see the manor house and you can see the castle, and you can look at the remains of the castle and you can see what he's drawn there. Very well, actually. Crickhowell's a bit harder because there's only one bit of wall left in Crickhowell now.
Okay, so on to another question. So we've can you describe some of the survey methods that would have been used in the surveys? People, instruments used, timescales, and so on?
I mean, the short answer is that it's essentially what you do now, only a lot simpler. I mean, you would have used trigonometry, no doubt, and you would have probably used chains or poles, and some sort of plane table, and you'd have drawn the angles and worked everything out from there, and then sketched in the bits in between, probably. So in some ways, the science hasn't changed that much. It's just the instrumentation used, really.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as for the people, we don't know whether he was doing this on his own or whether he had a whole entourage of people to help him. I suspect he probably had some people helping, because it's blooming difficult doing it on your own because there's nobody to hold the poles up and things. Or hold the other end of the chain. So yeah, I mean, he would have probably had people to help him, but we don't have any detailed description of his work, so we don't know that exactly what the exact thing was. But and there were, at this time, there were books on surveying, on how to do it, and there were books on how to draw maps and how to decorate maps and so forth and so on. There were even pattern books for how to create the borders around your map and things like this. And these things were in common usage. I mean, we know that he did have an interest in not only doing surveying, but encouraging good surveying as well.
Okay, so we've got another question we've got in. So it's have you encountered low quality maps in present works despite great tech available?
It depends on, I suppose there are plenty of low quality maps out there, not necessarily due to the surveying work, but possibly due to the editorial work or the people compiling them. And it's difficult to tell because so many maps these days that are published are just sort of regurgitating existing surveys, especially Ordnance Survey data. and there are good quality maps and poor quality maps. There's one of the biggest faux pas I've ever seen is I can't remember who published the map, and if I did, I probably shouldn't say, but there was a map that was published bilingually in Welsh and English, and they had obviously not employed a proper translator to translate the Welsh, because in the English on the map, it used the word inset, and the Welsh translation was HMS, which actually stands for Hyfforddiant Mewn Swydd, which translates as in job training, which is of course what inset stands for when you're talking about an inset day with school teachers. It's in-service training is what inset is short for. But they've taken that word inset, and of course they've just translated it through Google or something and ended up with the wrong word. But they stuck it on their published map. So yeah, quality control is variable.
Yeah, I think that's also always an interesting challenge. And yes, that's some of the amusing bits when you discover that someone has someone's using some interesting means of translating when they're not a native speaker, and it's
Yeah,
oh dear.
and I've seen a few maps from places in the Far East where they have used I don't know what they've used to translate them, and they basically come out as being complete gibberish when they're translated into English. But it's always good to have a proper translator to translate your work. Don't
Okay.
rely on Google.
No, I have to say, no, it's been a it has been a very interesting, it was a very interesting talk, and it was a very interesting talk that you've given us, and very nice insight, and it's just showing us something that's been captured at a unique moment that seems to buck the trend of what some of the mapping you see from that era. That it's actually entirely identifiable, and for such an area that's not an urban area, which would be which at that point many of them seem to start following grid patterns, so they're a lot easier to map out. This was an estate which were able to do a nice map, which is a very detailed map, and thank you very much for providing that.
This is the period of that explosion of cartographic innovation that, and I'll talk about tomorrow. Some of the cartographers I talk about tomorrow, people like George Owen, very, very innovative in what they're doing, very modern in some ways. Alphanumeric grids, and with place name indexes with grid references. It's something you don't expect at that time, really, but people were doing.
Okay. No, thank you very much. And yes, and again, that's another reminder to everyone about the event tomorrow. And if you wish to, attend and get online access, you can look at the links that Huw has sent out, that will have more information there. So I want to say thank you very much to one question is tomorrow being recorded? That's a good question.
I don't actually know. It probably, but I couldn't say. I think it is. Don't ask me when or where it will be made available. These things have a disappear into black holes sometimes. So
well, hopefully it's potentially then. So hopefully for anyone else afterwards, they might be able to access that. But yes, so I'll just finish us off now and say thank you, Huw, for the talk. Thank you for sharing this interesting bit of information and this and just and the topic in general. It's been a bit of a nice eye opener of the area. Thank you for joining us today. I want to thank you once again for the talk, and I hope that you'll join us next time for another Tea Time Talk, where we'll hear about Churchill's Secret Chart Makers from Adrian Webb, and this will be in the month of the 80th anniversary of D-Day. But for today, thank you and goodbye.